I'm Dr. Gigi McMillan. I am the Acting Graduate Director for the Bioethics Institute. It's a real pleasure to hold an in-person event. I'm so happy to see faces that are not my own family. Thank you so much for that. Before I introduce our guest, I want to point out a few things. First, and most obviously, the last 2 years of pandemic have changed us all, changed our world in ways that cannot be undone. And we have individually and as a society been forced to think of science, disease, public health, our own safety in immediate and practical terms. The importance of accurate medical and scientific information that can be shared in understandable ways has never been more important. In the past months, our Bioethics Institute has offered formal webinars and casual Zoom conversations about vaccinations, ethical research, COVID policies in hospitals, and international medical triage practices. We have paid a lot of attention to science and to public health systems, but there are other considerations. For example, what is the psychological toll, the cumulative psychological toll on our frontline workers, the doctors and the nurses? What happens when a patient feels compelled to take an unproven medication because they are short of breath and there are no other options? How are families dealing with the trauma of separation from loved ones as they lay dying? It's difficult to measure the human element in these medical scenarios, but one way that people process this kind of life experience is through the sharing of story. And here's my segue into tonight's presentation. These medical stories are important all the time, not just in times of a global pandemic. A patient's relationship with a doctor and a citizen's relationship with a researcher are interactive. And if you think about it, there can be no relationship without the patient or the citizen's personal narrative. The offering of the story, the stringing together of meaningful events that are colored by subjective value, this makes the storyteller vulnerable. It is an invitation to engage, and it is often overlooked or quickly disposed of in the rush to get down to business. Which brings us to tonight's speaker, Dr. Jasmine Gray, Assistant Professor of Communication Studies at Pepperdine University. Dr. Gray believes that the story transforms the soul. She's a narrative researcher with expertise in entertainment and patient narratives, and she's interested in how people in marginalized communities can use narrative to develop resiliency, and how the media production process can be used to empower these communities. After earning a bachelor's with a concentration in journalism from Middle Tennessee State University and a master's in television, radio, and film from Syracuse University, she spent 5 years in Hollywood working for companies that include BET and Paramount Pictures. As a doctoral fellow at UNC Chapel Hill, she developed an innovative storytelling tool called life plotting, which repurposes the narrative structure and character arc underlying fictional stories for use by real people, empowering them with self-affirmation and story-sharing skills to help them learn about themselves and how to share their stories with others. Her conceptual paper on life plotting was selected by the Visual Communications Division at the 2020 International Communication Association Conference for one of 2 top student paper awards. Dr. Gray moved to Los Angeles last summer. She returned to Southern California to begin her work at Pepperdine. Her passion for story motivates the way she teaches and relates to her students, and she continues to center her work on service. Her nonprofit, called Jazz's Jammies, has collected nearly 7,000 pairs of pajamas for sick and displaced children and organized volunteer opportunities for over 2,000 people. From the very first sentence I ever heard her say, I knew she had to come to LMU. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jasmine Gray to speak this evening for our Spring Bioethics Lecture.
Good evening. Y'all can do better than that. Good evening. All right, I'm going to first do a mic check. Mic check 1, 2. Y'all can hear me? Mic check 1, 2. Y'all can still hear me? Okay, that means I can move around a little bit and we can still kick it up. All right, I just want to make sure you guys can hear me. I want to start by thanking Loyola Marymount and Gigi McMillan for blessing me with this opportunity to speak with you all this evening. As someone who deeply values education, I understand how important opportunities like this are for scholars and students and community members to come together, to share, to learn, and to grow. And I want to thank all of you for being here. Not just for being in this room, but for being present and engaged during the time that we had together. As I speak, I'll be leaning into you for your love, your energy, and your engagement. Any opportunity to speak can ultimately become a sacred space for stories. Over the past 33 years of my life, I've been on a journey of learning how to combine the unique variety of experiences I've lived through into a narrative of what it is to be me. A narrative that is ever-changing. Arranging these reneged events into some kind of account, some kind of testament, some kind of testimony to the fact that I am here, that I exist, and that I matter. Now, at times, this work of constructing my story has felt excruciating. The situations that have occurred in my life have felt so disjointed that I could almost hear the dissonance in my ear as I tried to put these pieces of my story together, banging them, clank, against each other, clank, throwing them to the ground in frustration, clank, clank, and then picking them up again, trying once more to make sense of it all. And when I can make my story make sense, it feels like freedom. Like taking the deepest breath, like living a life I understand, like knowing who and whose I am. I was born with a craniofacial disability called arteriovenous malformation, one of the rarest vascular anomalies in the world. Now, it's a long word that basically means my arteries and my veins are connected incorrectly. Too much blood rushes through, destroying everything in its path. For me, that meant my bone structure, tissue, muscles, teeth, chin, tongue. For others, it means eyes and ears, noses and throats, and even brains, leading to aneurysms, strokes, and in the most severe cases, death. To date, I have had nearly 50 surgeries in 20 years, from age 10 to 31. My last surgery in 2019, which I'll discuss later, was the second longest procedure I've ever had. I was forced, due to new growths in my jaw, to have the majority of my lower mandible removed and replaced with the bone from my right leg. Now this, in addition to a face that has already been paralyzed on the right side due to experimental procedures gone horribly wrong. So when I speak my stories to you, it takes not only emotional stamina, it takes physical strength. Every word is pushed past strained muscles in my left cheek, through a top lip and teeth that have no counterpart on the bottom, and even my tongue. My tongue that has been infected by illness, cut open and sewn shut. My tongue that has been worn out and blistered over. I use that tongue today. I give it to you, to reach you, and to move you. Because as all patients do, I want you to see me. I want you to accept me for all of who I am. Not just for who I am in the context in which you might meet me. In a gray and white hospital gown with my backside exposed. In a clinical trial, desperate for a drug to be an answer to a prayer. In a vulnerable state where I am in some way dependent on others, possibly on you. I want you to know me as an equal too. As scholar, as advocate, as international speaker, as nonprofit founder, as a great friend, as a good daughter and sister, and as somebody's future wife, okay? And if you're in the audience, we'll have to talk at the reception after this, okay? And don't we all just want to be seen clearly? Don't we all just want to have left some kind of impression on someone that says, I was here? Snap if you feel me, if you ever been there, right? Ultimately, this is why those of us called patients tell personal narratives in the first place. Theologian and author Timothy Keller says it like this: to be loved but not known is comforting, but also superficial. To be known and not loved, that's our greatest fear. But to be fully known and truly loved is, well, a lot like being loved by God. It's what we need more than anything. It liberates us from pretense, hungers us out of self-righteousness, and fortifies us for the difficult journey of life ahead. And those of us called patients have certainly been through our fair share. There are two main thoughts I want to explore with you this evening in our conversation, and I'm going to number these points 1 and 2. 1, the types of narratives we tell as patients are worth understanding because they can either confirm, condemn, or contextualize the role of medicine in our lives. I'm going to repeat that one. The types of narratives we tell as patients are worth understanding because they can either confirm, condemn, or contextualize the role of medicine in our lives. And number two, the importance of narratives we tell as patients are worth understanding because how you handle our narratives can either help us become the highest versions of ourselves or hinder us in a way that does irreversible harm. With each of these avenues of discussion, there may be some concepts or information you've heard before, and there might be some information you're hearing for the first time. Either way, I want to encourage you to engage on an open heart and an open mind. As we continue on this journey we started together, I'll be sharing scenes with you from my own stories to illustrate key points, either in my life as a patient, which I did for 23 of my 33 years of life, my work as an advocate, which I've done for over 20 years, my work as a communication professional, which I've done for over 15 years, or my work as a narrative researcher, which I've been off and on for the past 10 years and full-time for the past 4 years. In my current research, I'm deeply invested in examining the effects of narratives on personal empowerment and also community empowerment, and the uses of narratives toward building a particular kind of resiliency. The kind of resilience that gives us courage to confront our own assumptions, to grapple with the stories that challenge us, those that challenge the ways we look at people who seem vulnerable to us, like patients, and those that challenge the ways we have always gone about work that impact the lives of patients. And then, to actually live life differently after we've encountered the power of personal narrative. So, if you're ready to take this ride on this journey with me, I need to hear you say, "Let's roll, Jazz." Let's roll, Jazz. Y'all can do that in there. "Let's roll, Jazz." Let's roll, Jazz. All right, let's go. Okay. So before we talk about the ethical considerations of the types of narratives that patients tell, we have to take a second to just consider the ethical implications involved with the concept of a personal narrative in and of itself. First, we need to nuance the concepts of a story from the concept of a narrative. The concept, oftentimes the words are used interchangeably, and I've probably done that several times already, but it's worth teasing out the difference. For practical purposes, a story is any account of experiences or events set in a particular time and place. Medical anthropologist Cheryl Mattingly says it like this: stories are about someone trying to do something and then what happens to her and others as a result. A narrative, on the other hand, emphasizes how a story is told. For example, the story of COVID-19. There are many different and competing narratives regarding the origins of COVID, who is impacted, and how to stop it. One of my close friends had a narrative that she would never get vaccinated because she just didn't believe in vaccines. And then a close aunt of hers, her mother's sister, was diagnosed with COVID and went into critical condition. Her narrative changed. She would get the vaccine because now she saw it as a way to protect those she loved and herself from serious hospitalization. The same story may vary in relation to who tells the story or the purpose of the story for the intended audience, according to psychologist Jeremy Gruner. So, the first ethical implication of a personal narrative is that rather than simply taking a story at face value, personal narratives call us to critical thinking. Who is telling the story? Who are they telling the story to? Why are they telling the story? And why are they telling the story that way? Is this making sense? If it's making sense, snap for me. All right. As we transition into talking about the types of narratives patients tell, I have to let you in on my hidden agenda. There's a truism about narratives that I want to refute. There's a truism about narratives that I want to unravel. There's a truism about narratives that I want to destroy because it's hurting patients across a wide range of patient communities. But I can't say it too loudly. If I say it too loudly, the narrative police, the narrative coco, they come in here and just storm off and take me away. So I'm gonna need y'all to come in close. I need y'all to lean in. Y'all gotta lean in. Okay, I'm gonna whisper. Okay, y'all ready? Narratives are not always a good thing. Okay, I'm gonna say it one more time. Narratives are not always a good thing. Whew. I'm glad I got that one off my chest. Now we can talk about a few reasons why. So, illness narrative is a term that scholars often use to describe a certain subgenre of personal narratives that is specifically focused on the sick and the disabled. This really dope guy named Arthur Frank is a pivotal figure in a field called narrative health humanities. He's a sociologist and was a cancer patient. He conceptualized 3 ways that narratives are often structured by people who are grasping in a variety of ways with illness. Each type of narrative has implications for how patients experience life, and each type of narrative is either pushed forward or pushed aside by those who walk alongside the patient. From our caregivers and our family and our neighbors, to our healthcare providers, bioethicists, and scholars. 2 mediated forms of narratives, mediated forms of communication, and thus out to society at large. The beliefs you have about these narrative types will impact the decisions you make about what might be right or wrong regarding patients, and your lens of looking at patients may be shaped by an affinity for the type of narrative that makes you most comfortable. The first narrative type is called a restitution narrative. Now, these are the narratives those in science and medicine and public health usually love. In restitution narratives, a person has some encounter with an antagonist called illness. And then they fight that antagonist. Disease, hunch, hunch. Disability, hunch, hunch. Pain, hunch, hunch. Then they resolve the issue. Diagnosis, I got the correct diagnosis on the first chart. Ow, woo. Medical treatment, the doctors know exactly how to treat me, and the treatment worked, yay! And then the patient can just return to health. I'm cured. I have a brand new insert advancement named Classical Life Science. I'm fixed. I'm normal. I'm happy. And now I can live a wonderful life. And it's all thanks to biomedicine. Thank you so much, biomedicine. You did it. Now, I'm exaggerating that narrative, but only slightly, because I want you all to really understand why this version of our patient's personal narrative may be healing to some of you, to some of us. This restitution narrative describes some of our deepest desires for stability in our own lives and in the lives of others, for continuity, so we can make sense of our challenges and help others make sense of their challenges, for control, so we can navigate through uncertainty and help others navigate through uncertainty, knowing that things will eventually get, quote unquote, back to normal. For some patients, the restitution narrative may actually ring true. I was healthy, and then I was sick, and now I'm healthy again. And you may have witnessed what seems to be a restitution narrative in the lives of patients you've known. But I would challenge you to consider the extent to which the stories you have encountered, those that seem to follow that narrative structure, have actually been crafted and maybe even crammed into this kind of template. When I was born, there were only two things that were different about me because of my condition. I had a birthmark on my right cheek. It was reddish brown, soft, and warm. And I had an enlarged tongue. My tongue was twice the size of a typical newborn. And the doctors told my parents not to worry. They told them that everything was normal. And I was misdiagnosed for the first time with a vascular mark called a port wine stain. Over the next several years, I became the little girl who was smart and energetic and bright, with a world of possibilities for my future. I had dreams of being, well, a storyteller, but not a boring public speaker. No, I was going to be a trickle threat, okay? Listen, I was going to be a singer slash actress slash dancer. And I was going to take the entertainment world by storm. I had two loving parents who supported me and my sister in exploring anything we wanted to do with our lives. And my mom made sure we were always cute, okay? Our hair was always, as black people say, laid. And everywhere we went, we got compliments. By the time I turned 9, my birthmark in my tongue was accompanied by a protruding bottom lip. And because I had started to be teased by other kids and started to feel self-conscious, my parents decided to consult with a local surgeon who said that he could help us. And I was misdiagnosed again for the second time with a less complex condition called a hemangioma. I entered the world of medical treatment and became, for the first time, a true patient. By the time I was 15, a combination of increasing health complications and a mix of successful and unsuccessful corrective surgeries had left me with physical health and physical features that went in and out of periods of stability. Times when there were no new growths and no new pain. Times where I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. When I was reassuring everyone around me in my circle that the last surgery was the last surgery. And there were times when none of those things were true. There were new growths and little light. I would have pain so severe that it felt like my head was about to just explode. And I would then rush to the hospital thinking that I was dying. Having parts of my face and mandible removed and replaced with skin from my back and my stomach. Having my muscles paralyzed and learning to speak and eat all over again, having feeding tubes down my throat, spending months and months in the hospital, and years of high school down to my home. I was anything but reassured. And right in the middle, I was right in the middle of the second type of narrative that patients tell. It's called a chaos narrative. In contrast with the restitution narrative, I was healthy, I got sick, and I'm healthy, and I'm all better. A chaos narrative has no defined structure. As Frank says, events are told as the storyteller experiences life, without sequence, without cause. In other words, the patient cannot yet imagine how the plot of their life gets any better. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. There is only stumbling through the darkness, one step, one breath at a time. Chaos narratives are the ones that those in biomedicine like to hear the least when they are in process, and like to hear the most when they are over, especially if they end in restitution. The definition of restitution, after all, is the restoration of something lost or stolen back to its proper owner. At its best, biomedicine could be described as the restoration of health, lost or stolen, back to the patient. And so, at this point in the story, some of you are expecting me to tell you how I got better, how biomedicine helped me, and believe me, I have such an urge to tell you that narrative about all the amazing specialists my parents found in a way that could only be described as divine intervention, about the outstanding nurses I've had to hold my hand through some of the scariest moments of my life, about the diligent researchers whose work, along with my body, has led to breakthroughs for generations coming after me who may have my same condition. However, telling that version of my narrative, which reflects the most common type of narrative patients tell, it would do us all a disservice. There are several ethical implications of a patient's personal narrative at play. First of all, for those in health and medicine, that restitution version of our narratives is not intended to simply serve the patient and give us a chance to quote-unquote tell our story. That narrative that forms is ultimately not about patients at all, but about those of you who work in the field, who aim to help patients navigate through health challenges. It prioritizes your purpose. It privileges your place in the world. It protects your personhood. When those in healthcare hear a restitution narrative, it can affirm their self-worth and their sense of what they should be doing to make the life of a patient what it should be. As a result, subconsciously, patients get a clear picture of the type of narrative that is good and right. Without any intentional effort, those in healthcare and medical research have become co-authors, co-creating the patient's stories that ultimately serve their own ends. Okay, Jazz, well, okay, what's so bad about that? I'm glad you asked. One problem is we as patients, we're just not prepared to handle the chaos. Our hands have not been taught to hold desperate events together that have no defined storyline, emotions that are still in process, and thus narratives that cannot be clearly articulated because they're still confusing to ourselves. We are still in it, and things are just, well, chaotic. Unlike restitution narratives, or even the final narrative I'll discuss shortly, the chaos narrative is what I consider written in the whirlwind. As Frank discusses, these stories are told in the midst of the tornado of health circumstances. We write them in the rush words of an overwhelmed heart and in the silence-filled gaps of an overwhelmed mind. In our dissertation, titled A Description of How We Tell Our Stories, I conduct the first feasibility study for a storytelling tool I call life writing. It uses fictional storytelling principles to guide a participant through a precise process of making sense of the things that have happened to them and how they changed, all in order to tell stories in a way that better connects with others. And I conduct workshops around life writing, not only for patients, but for those in academia, community organizations, and those in corporate spaces. In the introduction to that dissertation, when I discuss my first and my most intense chaos narrative, I highlight another truism about narratives, another level that I'm about to verse once and for all right now. Y'all ready? Okay. It's the assumption that all narratives are coherent and that coherent narratives are good narratives. Now, by coherent, I mean a sequencing that makes sense to ourselves and others. It's not only the assumption that all narratives have a beginning, middle, and end. It's the assumption, which is indeed an assumption, that all narratives should have a beginning, middle, and end. That coherent narratives are better than other ways of organizing our experiences. Research actually shows that chaos narratives are not only valid, but they're often necessary. For example, identity research has found that the periods of life we often call crises, like a midlife crisis, or for those of us who are in college, a quarter-life crisis, right? That's a real thing. They're actually integral to our identity development. The chaos narrative is also a key stage in the identity development of a patient. And if it's necessary for the patient, then it's worth hearing for all of us. In my dissertation, I say, the outside person listening to my chaos narrative would have to strain themselves against the forceful storm of my disjointed and disordered story elements, leaning into me as a person and listening for what cannot be said. Well, Jazz, how do you listen for what cannot be spoken because it's not yet understood? You stand. You stand in the whirlwind with the patient as a witness to their testimony as it unfolds. You don't tell them that they'll get back to normal because, as we discussed, it negates the value of the season that they are currently in. And it pushes a narrative that there will be a normal to get back to. And as we know through the Zoom meetings that are still on all of our calendars, right? Many of which used to be phone calls. Y'all remember phone calls when people used to get on the phone instead of Zooming? Many in the hand sanitizers that are outside of every hallway, and also the loved ones we've lost that we may not see again on this time side of life. Returning to normal is not always an option. Likewise, for many patients, particularly those of us who are patients for any significant period of time or with any significant changes to us physically, emotionally, or spiritually, the normal we knew before, we may never experience that again. You see, all along my journey, starting with the doctors who pulled me out of my mother's womb, the doctor who himself was a product of a larger cultural environment with his own narrative about health and normality, certainty, and control, I was limited in my capacity to imagine a personal narrative beyond the one that life had trained me to value. The depression, the isolation, the hopelessness I felt during that chaos narrative, it wasn't only due to the challenges I faced with my health. Actually, as I look back on it, that wasn't the main issue at all. The problem was, no one in health and medicine had told me that the version of my narrative where they fix me and I go back to the way things were wouldn't be my story. No one in health and medicine told me the version of my narrative that only the people who stood with me in my storm would ever truly understand was also good and normal. And beyond all that, no one had told me that there was another way forward. I can remember the night the chaos started to clear, finally. Now, during my late teens, around surgery, 25 or 30 out of 49, before I had more reconstructive surgery, my face had become more and more distorted until I was completely unrecognizable to my family and friends, but even to myself. During this time, I couldn't dare to look in the mirror because I didn't want to see how I looked. I couldn't dare to look people in the eye. I was too ashamed to see them looking back at me, so I would go to shake a hand and hold my head down and glance around and look somewhere off into the distance. If I hadn't overheard my mother talking to a friend about how I was doing, I would have never known I was going through depression. I just knew that I was confined to my physical house, displaced by a body that no longer felt like home. And it all just felt numb. Until one night, when somehow I ended up on the floor of my bedroom. I could no longer see the green walls of my wallpaper. I couldn't see the purple bedspread because my eyes had filled with tears. My head wrapped in a bandage, my mouth swollen shut. I was down on my hands and knees. I was begging God. I was pleading with him to make me normal. And as I lay there in the aloneness, my face planted on the hardwood, my eyes closed, little did I know that this was the beginning of a breakthrough, where I would stop idolizing the narrative centered around stability and normality. I wrote about what happened shortly after in an anthology series called Storyalities. Fittingly, a combination of the words story and reality. And I want to read and expand on what I wrote then. I told myself, there is a such thing as normal. And one day, I will be it. I dreamed of that day. I made plans for it. And then, after that fateful night, it all started to change. One Sunday, I felt acceptable enough to show my face at church. Now, it wasn't my church because that would have just been too much for me. When I finally did return to the church I grew up in, the people I expected to gawk at me about how much my body had changed, they actually welcomed me with open arms. but I was not yet prepared for the possibility that spiritual family would treat me any differently than the rest of society. So I was sitting next to my daddy as a visitor, trying to be as invisible as I possibly could as the preacher at this guest church started to speak. I realized the sermon was about Carl in the castle. Cool, I thought. I know about Carl. Carl had a health challenge. Some believed it was poor eyesight, others say it's a speech disability. The preacher had started to say, Carl begged God several times to take it away. And then the preacher said, the God said, no. What? Now, wait a minute. Say, what now? I thought to myself. I squinted my eyes and I took a deep breath. God told Carl that he needed the health challenge, the preacher said, because it kept him humble, because it made him stronger. Now, I scrolled down my Bible to where the minister was quoting Jesus. See, I had been deep in my own thoughts and I lost track. Now, grace is sufficient for you because my power shows itself best through your weaknesses, Jesus said. My next thought was, so, I gotta be like this forever? And that was when the vanity of it all, of health, of beauty, of being normal, hit me. And I felt something. Guilt at first, and then something else. A weightlifting. Now, call me a pragmatist, call me realistic, or just woke, but sitting in that pew after laying on my bedroom floor, it was life-altering to grapple with this biblical fact. Now, grace is sufficient. God did not heal Paul. There was no physical fix. He didn't help Paul get back to normal. Apparently, my old narrative was not as important to God as it was to me. It was freeing to know there was someone invested in developing who I was as a person by any means necessary. And this is when I encountered the third narrative that captures the final type of narrative patients tell, the quest narrative. In quest narratives, a person does not return to the world they knew before. Instead, they are transformed by the journey. Frank says restitution narratives attempt to outdistance morality by rendering illness transitory. Chaos narratives are stuck in the undertow of illness and the disasters that attend it. Quest narratives meet suffering head on. Patients accept illness and seek to use it. Clocking in at over 10 hours, my last surgery just 3 years ago was the second most severe surgery I've ever had. It was traumatic from the beginning during the pre-operation process through the over 2-year recovery process. Notice I did not say from beginning to end. I am still healing from that surgery, both physically and emotionally. I'm just getting back to a place where I can walk after getting that jawbone replaced with a lump in my leg, and I'll never walk the same again. I'm just now reaching a point where I can speak the story of that experience without spiraling into itchy palms and a racing heart and a tight chest. I'll never be the same person I was before. And remember, I've done this thing called medical treatment nearly 50 times. So that's nearly 50 versions of my personal narrative to date. 50 versions of a story that all attest to the same testimony. that I am here, that I exist, that I matter, that although I cannot go backward, there is a chance to transform. That even when I cannot move forward, right where I am, right in the middle of my storm, there is a sacred story that can become solid ground. 50 opportunities to challenge what others believed personal narratives should say about what a well-lived life looks like for a patient. There are many reasons why people sell personal narratives. Through scholarship and personal experience, I have narrowed them down to 5. Affirming the self, transforming the self, advocating for the self, reclaiming the narrative for non-patients, and advocating for other patients. I hope you've seen the interplay of all 5 over the journey we've taken together to understand some of the ethical implications of personal narratives. For any and all fellow patients in the audience, I have a question for you. What do you do when you realize, despite having faced real life-threatening circumstances, that your emotional well-being is actually tied up into aspects of your journey that are outside of your control? What do you do when you realize that the one thing you have wanted most, a patient story with a clearly defined end, may not be what's best for you, may not be what's best for other patients? As I continue to consent to the reality that my story is a quest narrative, I can slowly start to see the stones of a divine path forward. That back to normal narrative is no longer worth my energy. There's one question I have for healthcare and biomedical people in the audience, for you all to consider as well. When you encounter chaos narratives, and almost automatically, often subconsciously start to shape or encourage a restitution narrative in the life of a patient. To what extent do these underlying truisms and assumptions and expectations of a patient's narrative contribute to a patient developing a desire for a version of their story that they may never truly realize, and that importantly could actually limit a broader, more liberating understanding of what their journey could be? Jesus once said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." As we move beyond tonight, let's continue to ponder these questions, probing ourselves for truth, speaking truth to power, freeing others to do the same, as we continue to construct our narratives together. Thank you for going on this journey with me tonight, and God bless each of you.
I feel like we should just be quiet for a minute. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jazz. We have some time for questions and comments, and I'm going to let Jazz answer them from your seat there. And we only have one mic today, so if you have a question or a comment, I don't really want to run all over the room. So maybe I will repeat it and then hand the mic to Jazz so she can answer, okay? But I do have a question first. And that is, it appears to me that the restitution and chaos and quest narratives, they almost look like stages where one is less developed and then one is a little more developed, and then really as a self-actualized person, I should have a quest narrative right at the end. Can you comment on that sort of definitely incorrect or maybe inappropriate valuation of each of those? Because I feel like in my own experience as a patient advocate, sometimes in the first moments when a patient is dealing with their illness, they just need to practice the restitution narrative and try it on for a bit. And it doesn't mean that it's wrong, it's just where they are at that moment. And then later, maybe the chaos is where they are. And they don't necessarily need to move to a quest narrative to finish their self-actualization. But I feel like when we think of restitution quest and restitution chaos and quest, we assume that is gradation towards a better result.
Thank you, Gigi. That's a great question. I think while I think it's definitely interesting to see the ways in which the types of narratives are aligned with our self-actualization, as you phrased it. But I also want to emphasize the idea that these narratives are not in sequence. Like you could have a situation where the first narrative that is really the most impactful to you is really the chaos. And it takes time to sort out what type of narrative it becomes next. And so that's why so many of you in this audience become so important. Because when someone is in the chaos, more than they need you to try to order their events for them, they need you to be there, right? And as you continue to be there with the person, you give them time, and you need the physical time, but also the emotional space to then begin to navigate your way from the chaos narrative to figuring out what other types of narratives you can tell with your story. And so the chaos narratives become critical at the beginning of self-actualization, and as we talked about, it's a crucial part of your identity development. They cycle through different types of narratives throughout our life.
Right, and I think maybe the point is maybe we start with chaos and then we're in a quest for a while, and then we get to a new stage of our illness or whatever we're dealing with, and then we're back to chaos, and then maybe we play with restitution for a while because we need to recoup or whatever, and we move on. So that's a very important thing. It's not just step by step. Do you want to sit here so you can face the audience? That'd be great. Are there any comments, questions? Yes. So the question is, could the life plotting tool that Dr. Gray has developed, could that become a form of therapy for people who are trying to work on their life issues?
Yes, that's actually, thank you for asking the question. That's actually one of my ultimate goals. I'm still at the beginning of the process of navigating to what extent it could be used as a tool. But some of the preliminary workshops I've done, I've actually done them with people at different stages of chaos or destruction. So we've done it with children with disabilities. We've done it with college students who are dealing with like really rough times, and we've done it through a care team member with a patient in a hospital setting. As those of you who are working in medical know, getting clearance to do research in a hospital setting with children is very tricky with the RID. So the idea, I was able to give it to one of their care team members for them to take, and then they gave me feedback about it. And the early feedback that we're getting is very good. My dissertation was done with disabled people of color, and so patients in the hospital, but definitely people who are dealing with bodily structural differences and different types of disabilities. And they talked about how it gave them a chance to really to see their narrative on paper, because the life plot is actually a worksheet that a person can fill out. And when you fill out this worksheet, it looks almost like an arc diagram. And there's a couple people in the audience I know are in entertainment, so we know about the narrative arc of a story in a fictional narrative. Well, this life plotting gives a person to an opportunity to construct their narrative as if they're the main character in the story. And then once that story is on paper, it gives them a little bit of physical and emotional distance to then analyze that story, the connections between the events that have happened to them and how they change. And so we're getting some early indications that that process does allow for some therapy well. And so we have to do some quantitative research to see the extent to which that is true. And our next step would be revising the intervention based on the feedback I received and then doing some experiments next. So thank you for asking.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, Flavius.
So you mentioned how important it is to be with someone when they're going through a medical experience. And so what I'm wondering is, especially in times of chaos, how important or how should you approach not telling them that they'll be back to normal, but that things will get better?
That is the $1,000,000 question. I have some students, and I'm the type of person, I'm always learning from others, and so I don't want to ever act like I just have all the answers. I'm teaching a class called communication training, and in this class, they're each working with some kind of Grongo calculation, and they just did a presentation yesterday about what it means to like hold space. And one key thing I thought was so practical, it was finding ways to use language that relates to the language that the person is using. So if they're not yet in a stage where they're using language about being all better and stuff like that, maybe that's not the language you're doing. If they're telling you I had a really rough day, the most important thing you can do is affirm where they are. Man, that's really rough. Telling you feel like talking that, you're going to talk about that, and go from there. Allow them to lead you versus you leading them. What happens oftentimes is we get uncomfortable. When other people are dealing with stuff, we get uncomfortable and we're like, okay, it's making me feel like you're gonna get there, girl. You are going to make it through, okay? And it's like, is this about you or the person, right? So I think sometimes sitting in it is allowing that person to lead the conversation, and you go where they take you. So.
Great. Thank you. Another one? Yes.
Thank you for your question. The first thing I say is I haven't always felt strong. As I can remember even a couple of years ago having a breakdown where I was literally on the floor. At this time, I was still in graduate school. I just got my PhD last summer, so y'all, I made it through the dissertation process. Okay, listen, okay. So last year this time, I was still in graduate school, and during the 3 years of my graduate school process, my health was doing its own thing, and I can remember falling down on the ground even then, and just being really upset about things. So I think part of my mental health journey was realizing that I need help. I don't know if you guys realize this, but this whole like prioritizing your mental health and self-care, it's always been a need, that it hasn't always been as commonly accepted as it is now. So when I was growing up, it wasn't as cognizant to be in therapy consistently. My parents, thank God, noticed when I was at the depths of some of my depression, and they talked to my doctors, and they recommended therapists. And one of the things that the therapist did, I think, was really helpful to me was give me condition to journal, like mental condition to journal. And journaling in a variety of forms really saved my life. That was not, it was not some of my early forms of storytelling, and being able to see that as a tool that could give me something to hold on to through all the other things that I would deal with. That I didn't get my first therapist until 3 years ago when I was in graduate school. And that's when I really realized, you know what, another realization I had to come to was that when you're dealing with illness over a long period of time, it's a cumulative impact. And a lot of people think that if you're dealing with something for a long time, that you're strong now. Like, you've been dealing with this forever, you got it. But the people that I talk to that have been through chronic illness, it's the exact opposite. You can get more fatigued as time goes on because of the constant battles. And so learning that I can go through the same level of intensity which I did in my last surgery, which was 12 hours, as I did earlier on, and it can have much greater impact on my mental health than it did then. Learning things like that were the catalyst for me to seek help. And I think that for me, my faith has been the one thing that has helped me to have an anchor. And this is why I say that in Gigi's reading of my bio, the story is a divine tool. The first stories I ever read were Bible stories of people who were dealing with all kinds of challenges and ups and downs in life. And reading about that, and obviously the most important of them being Christ, were really some of the first examples of how to overcome difficulty in life. And now, as my relationship with God deepens, I'm able to see new dimensions of what that means for how I heal and how I connect with others to help them heal.
You can hold on to that. As long as you speak up, then we're good.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
That's a great question. My first thought is that I think sometimes to your point, there can be multiple narratives happening at the same time. But also, I think that so one of the stories that I think resonates with a lot of people who are Christians in particular who are dealing with illness is the story of Job. And if you know anything about the story of Job, he's someone who has like all this property and land and all this stuff, right? He deals with his illness and he has loyals and his kids die, like all these terrible things happen to him. And at the end of the story, he gets that twice what he had before. And so sometimes you hear stories like that and you gravitate to the idea that that bad things happen to good people, and that your godliness is not connected to how much or how little you'll go through in life, which is important. But you can also grab onto this idea that I'm going to get double for my trouble. And then when it doesn't happen, for me, it wasn't even a choice. I felt like God was like, there's more here that you haven't been looking at because you're so focused on the narratives that you want to see happen. And so I think in the middle of my chaos, it was an opportunity for me to open my mind more. And so I think that's what chaos allowed for me to do. And it doesn't happen for everybody that way. I know people who are still struggling through the chaos. And some people for whom the way that people who are religious has spoken to them about illness has made them feel very much like um, illness is evil or cursed. And so I definitely don't want to act like everybody's experience with religion in terms of illness has been positive. So I think that for me, it was about having a very intimate relationship. Like when I was on that floor, it was just me and God. You know what I mean? And it was through that honesty, right? Because I was saying, I don't want this. I wasn't like, oh Lord, this is just, you know what I mean? I was like, no, I don't want this. And I think through that honesty and that vulnerability, which is a big thing, then God could open our minds to what other things He had to say to me. Yes, please do.
I know you since you were in the entertainment business, and it was very interesting to see the transformation because you were such a great executive and storyteller. How important was that period of your time to understand how stories really do have this kind of impact? And for everybody who's, everybody watches TV and watches movies and reads stories, it sounds very relatable for people to be able to connect that way because they've lived with us in their lives. How did this epiphany come to you that this was the way to go?
Yeah, thank you for that question, David. David is one of the mentors I got earlier in our time in the entertainment industry, and so I'm so grateful to have you here, and Tracy's here, who's also from our time in the industry. For me, I started to pick up on this idea that was later confirmed through research, where so before any major surgery I had, my dad and I would go to the movies. And the night before we would go to the movies, Daddy knows this is our tradition. And for those 2 or 3 hours, it was like nothing else was going on. The lights could go down, and I wasn't a patient. I wasn't a doctor. I was Storm from X-Men, right? And we would always go see an action movie too. Isn't that something? Action movie. Well, what is about action movie? What is about and all not ironically, it's not ironic at all. It's actually fitting. We would always see if there was an X-Men movie in particular, we would always see X-Men. Why? What about that was resonating with me on some kind of subconscious level? If you know anything about X-Men, they are these human beings who are other than human. They are the outsiders. They don't look like everybody else. They don't fit in. So I'm subconsciously gravitating to these stories, and these are the ones that I want to see before I go into my next hard time. And so then realizing, so I had an honest connection to entertainment narratives from that standpoint. Whenever I would go home and recover from a surgery, watching TV was like my connection to the outside world. So when I was watching MTV or BET when I was park or whatever my friends were watching, I felt like I was still in the know about what was happening. I remember the summer I turned 15, Beyonce's first video, Crazy in Love, came, and the first time I saw Crazy in Love video, I was in the hospital watching it on the hospital screen. Then like, is this a girl from Destiny's Child? I was just blown away, right? And so it was not real connecting. And so I had those early experiences, and then I knew that entertainment was a way that a form of storytelling that had impacts on large numbers of people. And so that was what drew me to the industry. And it was once I was in the industry, I was realizing, you know what, God, I'm enjoying what I'm doing. At that time, I was working in a department that acquired independent films from film festivals. So we were able to travel around, and I was able to go to Sundance. I went to Toronto Film Festival. I went to South by Southwest, and we were analyzing these films to buy for the studio. And I was having a great time. And I was at a point where I was about to get promoted to a manager, and it was just one of those moments where I was like, this is all great, but Lord God, I don't want to miss how I'm supposed to be using this for something else. And so I started to do some soul searching, and there were two different people within a week that said the same thing to me, which was make sure you're not climbing the ladder to success on the wrong building. And that's when I was like, okay. And going back to school to get our PhD was an opportunity to just give ourselves some time to think about how all these things fit together. And during the PhD program, it was when I realized that a lot of the things that I had noticed about the therapeutic impacts and how it felt then in the theater with my dad, all those things have a long history of theory behind them and research behind them that shows why entertainment narratives work. And so it was like, okay, let me combine that with the health piece and use the entertainment stuff to now help people in real life deal with health issues. So that's a long story, but.
So we have time for one more question, and then we have a reception outside. Yes, in the back.
I was wondering if in your research you had seen a difference in the way that these kinds of narratives arise and or what they look like in patients who are going through physical illness, patients who are going through mental illness, given that they could be such different contexts.
Thank you for that question. Most of the work we've done so far has to do with physical illness, but one of the people that I interviewed for my dissertation has developmental disability, and so that was my first opportunity to really explore something outside of the physical context, and I'm grateful that some of this preliminary evidence is showing that the tool, the life plotting tool, is still useful for people who are dealing with what may be mental or other types of challenges that are not physical. But you're right, there may be a different context, there may be different parameters. The biggest difference I've seen so far in looking at all the research has to do with the difference between an acute illness, so something that happens to you and you can get over it quickly, versus something that's sustained. The sustainability of whatever health challenges really has the biggest impact on the necessity to have other narratives beyond that restitution narrative, because you're not going through it and getting better.
Well, one more time, please. Let's thank Dr. Jasmine Gray.